Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Alex Hera. I'm a writer, film director, and alternate reality game developer. Over the last couple of years, I've made several documentaries about online alternate reality game communities, including the history of analog horror and Slenderverse, a documentary film series. My talk today is called Revisiting Chaotic Fiction, Chaotic Play in the Slenderverse blog community. There's a lot to go through, so I'm going to talk really fast and hopefully not go over my time. For those of you who've been around since the early days of the Unfiction Forum, this might be a fun nostalgic blast from the past. So, in 2007, Stacey, also known as Space Fast on the Unfiction Forums, proposed a framework to better, quote, define the concept space in which alternate reality games exist. Now, Stacey's framework encompassed fictional constructs that were shaped by the interaction between creator or creators and the audience. So essentially, if the story itself was in flux, if it could be altered by the audience's actions, then it would be included under the framework of chaotic fiction. And this would count whether the audience had only a little bit of impact or a lot of impact or somewhere in between. It was kind of trying to encompass these types of fictional constructs where the outcome was not predestined. For a bit of context as to why Stacey felt this was important, the debate around defining alternate reality games at the time felt kind of like this. I found this beautiful diagram while researching this talk. And as you can see, it's a chaotic mess of a lot of different terms and acronyms and arbitrary boxes and lines and graphs. And basically everyone trying to fit things into boxes in a medium where it's very much, it doesn't lend itself to being fit into boxes. So there was a lot of arguing about what definitions counted, what didn't, what box different things went in, when really all of these things were very heavily related, and we were kind of just establishing arbitrary distinctions. This is still an issue today in the alternate reality game scene, but it is less so. So Stacey's framework had three main axes. Can the audience influence the fiction? Or to put it another way, do they have any authorship over the fiction? And if so, how much authorship do they have? So are they doing improv? Are they doing role play? Are they commenting on social media posts and having the authors reply to it in character and therefore becoming a canonical part of the fiction? Are they making decisions that influence what happens next? Do they have authorship? The next one is rule set. Did the architect create a framework or a structure for the fiction? And if so, how rigid is it? How ordered is that fiction? How strict are the guidelines of how it works? Does the audience have a ton of influence to just create an entire chaotic mess of whatever fictional piece we're looking at? Or is it very kind of linear on rails? The third axis of this is coherence. Is there a plot? Because if it's not a plot, it's not really a piece of interactive fiction. So is there a plot? If so, how much plot is there? And also, how cohesive is that plot? Especially when you have a piece of interactive fiction where the audience is improvising and doing role play, it can be very incoherent. It could really be not a story at all. Or it could be something where, again, the authors exert a lot of control over the piece. And so even though the audience is interacting with it, they aren't really creating a gigantic mess. They are still relatively on rails, just making minor decisions. So a piece of chaotic fiction could be somewhere in between any of these. As you can see, you have the sphere here. Stacey visualized it kind of as a three-dimensional sphere where you have all three axes working in tandem, and that determines where in the sphere a piece of chaotic fiction would land, depending on how it fits on these axes. Now, interestingly, and we'll come back to this in a second, Stacey's framework was kind of predicated on traditional ideas of how interactive fiction works. So a framework where there is a puppet master or an architect creating the experience, guiding the audience, and an audience who is interacting with it. We will talk about why that is interesting in a moment. So Stacey's framework, the way that he conceptualized it, was that chaotic fiction was generated by this interaction between creator and audience. So in the alternate reality game scene, and really in a lot of immersive fiction in general, we have this idea called the curtain, which is what maintains the integrity of the fiction. It's a wall that shields the out-of-game puppet masters from the audience, lets them create the fiction, lets them do all of the behind-the-scenes stuff, and keeps the audience from breaking their immersion. But Stacey conceptualized it a little bit differently. He instead, as you can see on this diagram on the left, he conceptualized it as a space where the two parties came together inside the curtain, or what he said was inside the curtain. Basically, it was the border where these two parties met, the architect and the audience, interacting with each other without necessarily breaking the illusion of the fiction, where they affected each other to result in an unpredictable outcome. So essentially, the architects don't know exactly what the audience is going to do, and so what the audience does influences how the architects are going to react, how they're going to write the fiction going forward, and vice versa. The audience doesn't know exactly what the architects are going to do, so what the architects do influences how the audience behaves going forward as well. This interaction between these two parties was labeled by Stacey as chaotic fiction, as chaotic play, and that is the process by which chaotic fiction is created. Now, Stacey also posited something that I found quite interesting in his initial articles about chaotic fiction. He posited that it may be possible for chaotic fiction and chaotic play to exist in what he called an open source system, where there is no architect or puppet master, and that instead it is just people participating and interacting with each other to form fiction in this kind of immersive, interactive way, without anyone necessarily guiding them. So now let's take a look at the example that I mentioned up at the top of this talk, the Slenderverse. What it looks like if you take this framework to an extreme and create something truly chaotic. For those of you who are not familiar with the Slender Man, he is essentially an internet urban legend, a boogeyman for the digital age. He was created in 2009, on June 10, 2009, on the Something Awful forums by Victor Surge as part of a Photoshop image contest. Users were tasked with creating creepy Photoshop images where they took normal images and put creepy things in them. Victor Surge created the Slender Man. He created a number of creepy images, a couple of short paragraph blurbs describing the creature and describing encounters with him. And so for all intents and purposes, you could say that Victor Surge was the architect of Slender Man, but this really didn't last. Within only a couple of days after the creation of Slender Man, dozens of other forum users on this same thread started telling their own stories about Slender Man and making their own images, depicting stories about Slender Man. Now, this was done without the permission of Victor Surge. This was done without any real guidelines or rule set. And eventually Victor Surge did put forward a rule set for how to create stories with the Slender Man, how to interact with his character. The rule set was very minimal. It was just, all of this is amazing, keep it up. That was it. So basically, Victor Surge abdicated his role as architect of Slender Man. He gave it up to the collective internet. And so obviously with dozens or hundreds of people creating their own stories, the coherence of this was very minimal at first, but it did all have a loose connection in terms of how the creature worked and stuff like that. So very quickly after the creation of Slender Man, we saw Marble Hornets be created. This was kind of the most notable work about Slender Man that was created, and where most of actually his important traits came from. So Marble Hornets was a found footage web series / alternate reality game. They had YouTube videos that were filmed entirely in first person. They had social media accounts where they interact with the audience and presented everything as if it was real. Marble Hornets depicted several interesting things with the Slender Man, including his ability to teleport, his ability to glitch out cameras, his ability to make people sick with his presence. These were not present in Victor Surge's original images. And those three traits of Slender Man that I just mentioned are present in nearly every single other Slender Man story that came after Marble Hornets. So they established brand new traits for Slender Man that became essentially definitive to the character. So you can already see this was created 10 days after Victor Surge created Slender Man. And so really quite quickly, you start seeing people iterate on the character and start to bring their own ideas to the table. Things get really interesting with the Slenderverse blogs. So these were blogs, stories being told about Slender Man. They were written entirely in first person, and they were written not by authors, but by the characters. So you would go to Seeking Truth, which is a story about a detective named Zeke Strom who is investigating Slender Man. Tom Horan is the author of Slender Man, or the author of Seeking Truth out of game. But when you go to Seeking Truth, you wouldn't see that Tom Horan is the author. You would see that Zeke Strom is the author, right? These are two examples here. White Elephants is about a man named Robert Sagel who was trying to kill the Slender Man, and the tutorial is about someone named M who was attempting to create guides to help people survive the Slender Man. Now, these are really interesting because they started building on the character in terms of his lore, but also because they started doing something really interesting in the way they interacted with each other. So all of these blogs had their comment sections open, and the authors or the characters, I'll be using these terms interchangeably, they would interact with people who commented on their blog, replying to them in character. Essentially, these were all alternate reality games. But things got really interesting because they started commenting on each other's blog. For example, you could go to a post from the tutorial, and you would see Zeke Strom commenting on the post. You would see him have a full-blown conversation with M, and then add a chat on top of that. When you go back to Seeking Truth the next day, he would be talking about his conversation with M in the comment section of the tutorial in his next blog post. So very quickly, it started to become kind of an interconnected universe of storytelling. And it was described to me by one person I spoke to who was actually a part of this as something where you started to have to keep up with it every single day, because otherwise you would lose track of what was going on. These blogs would all be mentioning each other's characters. They'd be mentioning plot events that happened in other people's stories, incorporating elements into their own plots. For example, White Elephants created something called the Path of Black Leaves, which is an alternate reality which Slender Man can travel through, and which, if you know about the Path of Black Leaves, you can also travel through it. Other blogs, dozens of other blogs, without the permission of White Elephants, started using the Path of Black Leaves in their story. So essentially, they were all iterating on each other's lore, building on each other's ideas, and acting like they were all in the same universe, and all doing this entirely immersively. Essentially, you could say they were all inside the curtain together, but there was no puppet master, there was no architect. This was open source chaotic fiction. A couple of my favorite examples of chaotic fiction in the Slenderverse, we'll just go through two here. The solstice, on the winter solstice of 2010, there was a battle to try to kill the Slender Man. Essentially, White Elephant proposed that Slender Man would be weakened on the winter solstice, and so therefore they should try to go kill him. And dozens of other blog authors decided this was a great idea, and so they started volunteering their own battle plans and ideas, and basically planning to meet up together in universe on the winter solstice to try to kill the Slender Man. This battle did actually happen in canon. It didn't succeed because then all of their stories would be over because there's no Slender Man. But that battle did happen. Another interesting example is the character of Red Light. White Elephants at one point was hacked by a mysterious, unnamed, sassy hacker character. And in the comment section of that post, another blog author named the character Red Light because White Elephants did not provide a name for this character. Very quickly, within weeks after after this hacking of White Elephants, dozens of other blog stories about Slender Man started using Red Light in their story. And they all acknowledged that Red Light was from White Elephant. He had the same personality traits that he did in that initial White Elephants blog post. But they all started bringing their own ideas to the table and essentially using the character for their own stories as if he was just a part of the universe now. And they would also, interestingly, try to respect each other's lore to an extent. I mentioned cohesion earlier. There was an attempt at cohesion in the Slenderverse, obviously with a bunch of different authors doing this all at the same time. It gets kind of messy, but it can't be an entirely coherent story. But like, for example, one blog would kill off Red Light, and then the next time Red Light showed up in another person's blog, they would explain how Red Light came back to life. So it wouldn't be like one person could make a decision that forever affects the universe, but they would try to generally make things as coherent as they possibly could. Now, why is this interesting? There's a couple different reasons. First of all, this is an example of open source chaotic fiction, and one of the very few that I've seen that has just this sheer level of coherence and interactivity between authors. But interestingly, chaotic fiction was the term the Slenderverse blog community chose to define themselves with. Chaotic fiction is not like a relatively well-known concept. It's not incredibly common for this term to be known about really in any interactive fiction spaces or the alternate reality game scene in general. But the Slenderverse really kind of latched on to the term chaotic fiction because they felt that it was the best descriptor of what they were doing, where they were all interacting together without an architect, without a puppet master, all telling their own stories, and just creating this gigantic shared universe or shared narrative, you could call it, where they felt like they were both an architect and also a member of the audience at the same time. Each independent blog was its own ARG. You could go, you could read it, you could comment on it, you could kind of affect what happened in the story, depending on if you talked with the author. But you also couldn't understand any single Slenderverse blog without understanding the larger tapestry of what the Slenderverse was. Because, as I mentioned, you would have to keep up with it every single day, or you would start to get confused because people would be mentioning stuff in their stories that happened in other people's stories. And so it was kind of a full-time job for these people, even though no one was getting paid, and it was just collaborative fiction on the internet for fun. So some closing thoughts here. Some interactive fiction and the emergent storytelling that results from that interactive fiction can be better understood through the framework of chaotic fiction than really any other framework that I've found. The relationship between creator and audience can also be conceptualized through this framework in some ways, like the way that a writer or developer would react to audience feedback, or even the ways that like offshoot fandoms can spring up from original works, right? Like the Marauders fandom from Harry Potter, where it's a bunch of different people iterating onto those ideas to create an entire universe that is almost unrecognizable from the source work. So perhaps 18 years later, we shouldn't just completely forget about chaotic fiction. Maybe it could still be a useful and novel framework for some interactive fiction today. And that is my talk. Thank you very much. Thanks. Some time for questions. Yeah. Any questions?
Do you know if all of the collaborators were from SA or did they branch out from
It became kind of the collective internet. The Something Awful forums, you could say, originated Slender Man and was doing a lot of the initial mythos building, but very quickly, like basically as soon as Marble Hornets took off, it became really kind of a thing of the collective internet.
In your talk and in your documentary series, you mentioned that these ARG creators, they tend not to claim authorship or publicly interact with their audience. Actually, they tend not to interact with their audience. Do you think that's like a hard rule that they can't have like an out of character authorship interaction? Or do you think that's detrimental when they do? Because I think people could generally understand ARG this is the thing, that this is a real person. Obviously, don't ask what they're like going to do next. But
Yeah, you're touching on a lot of very complicated topics. I could talk about this all day. In the alternate reality game scene, especially early on, we had something called "This is not a game," which was the kind of defining rule of how alternate reality games work, where you never acknowledged that it was fictional. You always acted in person or in character. If you were a puppet master, you never interact with the audience out of game. This kind of went out of fashion in the last like 5-10 years. But for a time, like the Slenderverse blogs, there are still authors of Slenderverse blogs who we don't know who they are because they just did it entirely in character, entirely immersively, and never came forward. So yeah, that is definitely a thing. They did have a private Facebook group, which some of them joined. But if you want to know more, go watch my documentary series.
Both still active, and if none of them are, was there ever a weird attempt to make an ending for us?
So theoretically there are still some active ones. I think all of the like notable ones that you would kind of look at as canonical pieces of the Slenderverse have ended. But there are probably still some small blogs with like 2 readers out there somewhere. As for an ending, no, because it was never intended to be a piece of coherent fiction in the first place. And so therefore there wasn't really a way to do something like that.
I was wondering, could those then, if they've all kind of filed down, could they be woven together in sort of a, because I didn't read them as they were going on, now you're implying it's too late for me to do so, but if I read them as a book, or they were all in the, in their chronological order,
yeah, I mean, you could do that, and it would probably be a very interesting experience. I've done something similar when I was doing my documentary research, but it's the kind of thing where it's not as coherent as you would like it to be.
to be whether or not, if people were ripping on the thing that happened in somebody else's blog the day before, is it possible that it's the same person, right?
Theoretically possible, yes, but it's generally, a lot of these authors have come forward in the last couple of years, and so we do know that most of them were different people.
You briefly mentioned the idea of some of this being canon and some of this being not canon. If that's something that the community adopted, then how does canon and not canon play into the idea of chaotic fiction?
There's really no actual coherent idea of canon in the Slenderverse. It's what you want it to be. So if you want to ignore a blog and say that's not canon to my version of the Slenderverse, you could do that. Or you could say everything is canon, even if it's contradictory. Because if you do look at everything as a coherent canon, there is a lot of contradiction.
Great talk. You said something interesting about how some of the authors would also play as characters with the veneer of pretending that there was an author behind it. You create something or invent something, and then other authors or even other audience members would suddenly respect that this was maybe not canon, but like they would respect some of the rules. It kind of sounded to me like distributed improv in a way, in the sense of like you're always yes-anding your partners. Do you feel like there's other rules like that, or that the unspoken rules in this type of collaboration?
I think it kind of depends on what community you're looking at. In the Slenderverse, there weren't really that many like strict rules exactly, besides don't kill the Slender Man, because that kind of defeats the point. There were, as I've mentioned a couple of times at this point, there was plenty of contradiction in the Slenderverse blogs, even though they were part of a coherent canon. That doesn't mean that they actually were coherent entirely if you look at it as a collective piece. But there's also, just as an aside, this does kind of brush up against like role play and even like other sorts of improvisation online. So there is some similarity there.
so it would be possible to have chaotic fiction that is an ARG, like immediately things like Homestuck, like but is it possible to have an ARG that is chaotic fiction?
That is a fascinating question, and I think the answer is probably not. Because the second that a audience member interacts with an alternate reality game, they kind of become a canonical piece of the fiction, and so therefore they have a form of authorship. And every alternate reality game has a rule set for how the audience is supposed to interact with it. So yeah, I would say you can't really have an alternate reality game without it being a piece of chaotic fiction, but you certainly can have chaotic fiction without it being an alternate reality game. The entire point of this framework was to try to unite many of the different forms of interactive fiction, which are heavily related, but were being arbitrarily separated.
So would you say any sufficiently explored fandom, and then lots of people have written fan fiction, is chaotic fiction.
I think you could probably say that, yes.
We don't have any more questions.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
All right.